Okay. Actually, in terms of thinking about the future, I always like to think about themes that I see are going to play out during the next years, given what I think the themes were of the last decade or, starting off, and what has happened over time. Really, I think WTO of China, it was entered in 1997, which led to great exports and domestic development of huge amounts of infrastructure, with both the state-owned enterprises and a large development of the small, medium enterprises that have really been the lifeblood and the growth of the innovation and in China itself. But I think what has happened is, in the future, I think, as was discussed here, that the export-based led view is going to slow down in the years ahead, simply because labor, if one wants to move to a consumption economy away from an infrastructure economy, it's necessary to have income and wages. You can't have a consumption economy unless someone has money to consume. So wages have gone up, and as wages have gone up, it's made other countries now competitive with light industry in China. In fact, India, in some sense, is will become a huge competitor in the sense of holding the future light industry growth. So the idea is, when we move up the value chain and the greatness of the SOEs and the SMEs, is to move from an efficiency enhancing a low-cost producer, having the opportunity to go up the value chain and compete with skills, with innovation, with new types of technology that are usable around the world. So I think that what happened in the US with 9/11, unfortunately, and with the fiscal and monetary stimulus, which led to huge imbalances in the United States, obviously culminating in the crisis of 2008, even though government officials don't want to claim they had any role to play at all in the stimulation of the crisis with low interest rates. I will defer to them, but I oppose what they're actually saying. So I think a really false growth, and it also had asset bubbles. If you look at real income in the United States in terms of wage income, it has not increased dramatically since 2000, even though financing had allowed to a lot of consumption, credit, and et cetera in the United States. Obviously, with the breaking the bubble, with real estate finance being very tough, that will slow down as well. The euro created this mess, okay, which basically had a consumption, asset inflation boom in the periphery by actually having the euro and using the idea that too big to fail, or that Germany and other countries would tend to support the growth of countries such as Italy, Spain, Portugal, and unfortunately Greece. And so there's a huge imbalance that has to be corrected in Europe, which will take some time to effect, in my view. So all of these themes will slow reverse. So the themes I see for the years ahead, which are going to be, in my view, very important for the world, is that the U.S., there's going to be insourcing. Basically, the technology in the U.S., the great investment in technology and that the United States has made over the last number of years, is going to lead to make the U.S. very competitive. It's very competitive in terms of substitution of technology for labor, and the cost of technology, robotics, robots, and nanotechnology, 3D technology, all the technology that the United States is now employing is going to make it is very competitive in terms of upscale production. And also the idea, what the internet has been doing or continuing to do in the United States, is changing the structure now of not talking about the Internet of Things, which is just monitoring things, but really the idea of making products and services more individualized, more idiosyncratic to the needs of individuals. So products are being reformed, and the way in which customers are defined. So research and development is wrong way to think about research and developments. Research, testing, development, and testing. It's a testing component. To test, you need to be near the markets. And so US corporations are going to have to test and do their research in China. If they're going to address the Chinese market, Chinese corporations are going to have to do similarly in the United States if they're going to address the United States market. Because now with the idea of 3D printing or nanotechnology and all the ability to test and rechange products and make products more individualized, insourcing is a huge advantage advantage in countries.
Energy.
Another thing is energy, is the idea that basically, I never talk for 5 minutes. A professor always talks for an hour and 20 minutes, so sorry about that. Anyway, the second is energy. Not only do I talk about the ability of the United States now to be more self-sufficient in energy, which reduces transportation costs dramatically and changes the nature of things, but technology is being used to make our energy use more efficient. Cars, automobiles, the use of the idea of having the United States now, the use of microgrids, is really changing the whole nature of how technology is being deployed. As the cost of scarce resources cost goes up, then technology is used to replace the use of those resources. So the scarcity is reduced through technology, and that's what's happening in terms of all of that in the United States. I see another great area is going to be the liberalization, internationalization and restructuring of the RMB and its use as an international currency. As China moves, you have to understand, in my view, as China moves to a consumption-based economy, they cannot produce all the goods and services that a consumption-based economy needs without importing from around the world, because a consumption-based economy, as a middle class builds itself, there's a need for many more things: medical, education, food, all the scarce resources that we have. And that's very important to think about how that internationalization, and this is the one belt, one road, is the idea of being able to import and export efficiently. So those things that can be produced in China efficiently, given scarce resources, given technology, can be done so in competition with importing it from the rest of the world. So I think that the idea is going to be very efficient. I look at the world, and the way I think about the interrelations of things is that I use 4 things that I always refer to in the way I think about, and they all have positive feedback and negative feedback to them. One is the idea of demographics. How does demographics affect the interactions of our society and people in terms of education, aging, sustainability, of infrastructure? And 50% of the world's population is now in cities. Within 30 years, 40 years, 75% of the world's population is going to be in cities. What does that mean for investment? What does that mean for needs for infrastructure? We've had 1910, 10% of the world's population in cities. In 2008, 50% of the world's population in cities. It's ever increasing to cities, and because it's the network, the connectivity that's so important for quality of life. So technology, there's, as I said, I'm not going to go through this, I don't have time, but just the technology that's being developed to improve our lives and meet the demographic and scarcity needs of society. The third thing is scarcity. What is resources? How do we use technology to eliminate, alleviate, and change the nature of scarcity in our societies? And so water is the scarcest resource that China has. You know, and the idea of how you create pricing of water to make efficiency, how do you create new technologies or import new technologies to make these limited supply of water more efficient? What is produced here? So governments, all governments in a sense, are either itself impede or foster change and foster growth, okay, in these particular areas, interactions. So these are the 4 things that are all interrelated. Now the idea of, I said this before, so I won't go through this, but in funding large-scale projects, it's the idea that we must reevaluate the value of underlying projects. How to value projects? They must enhance value. One of the problems that was referred to earlier, okay, was the idea, why don't we see private-public partnerships in terms of investment? Because if investments do not pay off, if investments are below cost of capital, where the state uses the wrong cost of capital, uses the wrong modeling, and assumes that infrastructure itself should be built just for the sake of building infrastructure, means that you have debt. And without returns, debt keeps building up. Debt keeps building up. So basically the idea of SOEs, corporations in China, state and local municipalities in China, real estate in China, debt has increased in China from $5 trillion in 2008 to $25 trillion today. Is there going to be enough returns, or how that debt is going to be paid off is going to be a very important criteria, and also does not lead to an ability for private capital to come in because of crowding out of public capital of this. So I think that one of the things that finance does is separate teams from capital. And the idea is that if the government interferes or is involved in that in a way in which there's not a sufficient return, you'll get crowding out. The government will crowd out the correct investors, are the ones who have the most interest in making things done. So I think that technology really reduces costs, and it really changes the whole nature of financing going forward. In terms of thinking about projects, okay, the three fallacies that I really think are important to consider is fallacy one, that if there's debt outstanding, if a company has debt, or a locality has debt, or a country has debt, a la Germany lending to Greece or to Spain or to Italy, then basically it's the case that if the country has debt, if you lend it more money, it'll be able to grow, it'll be able to have GDP, it'll be able to come out of its debt. Not only will it be able to pay off the new debt, it'll be able to pay off the old debt. And the fallacy of that is you have to do an evaluation. You can use the Black-Scholes model or any other model you want to evaluate what is the value of the underlying assets they're going to pay off, and will society pay off the debt, or will you have to have defaults and restructuring of that debt? So that's a fallacy. And the interesting issue is debt itself is not necessarily the thing that we should only look at in terms of thinking about the cost of capital for projects. So I think the second is the view that people are entitlements, the entitlement view, that give people entitlements. If you give them entitlements, that what'll happen is with entitlements, they'll be happier, they'll work more, they'll be able to grow more, they'll be able to have more reward. If they have more reward, then basically they'll be able to pay off and work for society. Society will have the resources to sustain them. The problem with entitlement, the idea of earning things that are not funded, that's a debt. So in Europe today, the debt that Europe has now to their citizens, whether the citizens only work 35 hours a week in France, have lifetime employment, have medical care, have no have early retirement, as in Germany, where you can have 120% of your retirement income level based on your final salary. So what is the incentive then to have children? First of all, it's very expensive to have children. Second, the incentive to have children. Why do you want your children to pay off on that debt? Or smart children leave because basically the parents or the older generation is taking the resources. Entitlements have a huge cost that we have to evaluate and understand that once you give someone something that's not funded, it's very hard, impossible to take that away. So learn what this means, okay, in terms of bad debt. This is bad debt, and so they don't grow it out. You don't grow it out. And what happens, you keep putting off until a later date exactly how to handle that particular problem. And the third is that the propensity is claimed, that prosperity is claimed to be a product of credit or debt. So lending infrastructure money through these development banks or giving to other countries, that we can create prosperity for these countries and they'll be better off and we'll be better off by that activity. But the major problem is that prosperity is not a function of credit. It's not a function of credit. It is a function of the value of the underlying projects, the underlying investment. That's what we have to evaluate, not just extending credit for projects. It's what's the value of those projects, and can it be the case that projects can pay back? And that has to be the way it's done. So actually, it's the case that financing is a byproduct of investment. It is not the force of investment. But we seem to say that we need to keep financing. And as a result of this, the major problem is you hear today, for example, Germany cannot leave the euro. If Germany leaves the euro, they'll lose all the exports that they have to the periphery. They'll lose the exports to Spain, they'll lose the exports to Italy, they'll lose them to the rest of countries because they export 60% of their exports are to within the Eurozone itself. But what does it mean to give credit? If you give credit to someone to buy your goods and services and your products and they never pay you back, What is it good to have GDP? You know, what is it good to export and no one pays you for what you export? So what is happening is Germany corporations are making money and GDP is going out. Then it's the case that Germany has to lend more and more through their banks to be able to exactly supply the GDP to Germany through the loans that they're giving to the rest of Europe without getting paid back. So the interesting issue is exporting. Some people say exporting surplus capital, exporting surplus to the rest of the outside of China, because you have excess steel production or excess iron use or other cement. Okay, that means that you still have to be paid back for that. It doesn't make it, you can't make something without getting paid, and it's not valuable to do such. So the idea is that to understand debt, debt has an interesting effect. Okay, and these are just my last slide. So what you have is growth in GDP and jobs. That's what we hear, growth, GDP, jobs. Forget the debt. Let the debt just stay under sub rosa. Let the debt stay underground. Let's not really think about the debt. Okay, but GDP is the wrong measure. GDP is not the correct measure. Wealth enhancement is the correct measure. Is the value of our human capital going up? Is the value of our physical capital going up in society? I can increase the GDP of a country. I can increase the revenue of a corporation, but that is not necessarily valuable. The question is, we have to think about what the value enhancing activities are, and then we can use GDP as a dividend, a cash flow, an indication. And jobs are created. But the question is, if you need to restructure enterprises to make them more efficient, then just to retain jobs is not the best model. So that means that debt difficulties down the road get bigger and bigger because you haven't addressed it. And when there's big debts outstanding of corporations or entities, the senior management does not want to innovate or create new things because they don't want to invest. They worry about their own jobs. They worry about sustaining it. That debt is like a cancer. Debt is a cancer. You have to get rid of it. It just starts and it builds up, and without getting rid of the debt, you can't have growth again. So debt has to hold back on growth because someone has to pay it back. It sits there. It doesn't go away. You have to do something to get rid of it. The other hand is debt. You concentrate on debt and reduction of debt and recapitalization of debt. How to recapitalize it? Even though we've heard in China that we recapitalize now some of the state and local debts by nationalizing it. What about the 62% of the debt that's held by corporations and banks that is now not repayable? That has to be done to get things. So which one do you choose as a politician? And to get that tension and choosing a politician. So more debt for the sake of debt or infrastructure projects to finance these projects sounds terrific, but are they value enhancing? That's really the most important question to ask. If they are, fine. But if not, one belt, one road means you'll need suspenders later on to hold your pants up because it's going to be very expensive to undo or expensive to get paid off on that particular activity. So thank you very much.